A term of art is a word or phrase that is in common use, but in a particular context has a precise meaning. This often applies to the law, and since the Constitution is a legal document, it applies to the Constitution too. The word war in the Constitution is a term of art, long understood to have a specific meaning as it pertains to a particular relationship between or among independent nations. It will be difficult to explain how to get our country back under the Constitution without making sure we understand what certain words meant at the time the Constitution was written. I am Jeff Robertson, a practicing attorney with over 35 years of courtroom experience and a retired Marine officer of 27 years of service, active and reserve. Around 20 years before the Constitution was adopted, a man named Sir William Blackstone published his outstanding work, Commentaries on the Laws of England. It is said that more copies of his work were sold in the United States than were sold in England, and the Founding Fathers were very familiar with it. In it he said, quote, "It is held by all the writers on the law of nature and nations, that the right of making war, which by nature subsisted in every individual, is given up by all private persons who enter into society, and is vested in the sovereign power. And this right is given up not only by individuals, but even by the entire body of people that are under the dominion of a sovereign. It would indeed be extremely improper that any number of subjects should have the power of binding the supreme magistrate and putting him against his will in a state of war. Whatever hostilities therefore may be committed by private citizens, the state ought not to be affected thereby, unless that, meaning the state, should justify their proceedings, and thereby become partner in the guilt. Such unauthorized volunteers in violence are not ranked among enemies, but are treated like pirates and robbers." Close quote. In actual war, soldiers of one nation may intentionally kill soldiers of another nation without being guilty of murder under any nation's laws. Terrorism is a method of fighting, not a specific country or even a political ideology. According to Blackstone, terrorists are nothing more than criminals from the standpoint of international law and are to be treated as such. Could the armed forces of some nation use terrorist tactics against another nation? Of course. But then the sponsoring nation would have committed an act of war, justifying a national response by the nation attacked in that manner. The response would be against the nation that sponsored the attack, not against the individuals committing the attacks. They would be subject to the law of nations as opposed to the criminal laws of the nation attacked. It is constitutionally impossible for Congress to declare war on a method of fighting, even though they have the authority under the Constitution to declare war. Congress also has the authority to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations, and can therefore make the tactic of fighting, we call terrorism, a crime to be punished under the criminal law. Even if Congress declared a war on terrorism, how would we know if we won? Who would surrender to whom? Who would sign the peace treaty or armistice? How would we be able to compel compliance by the individual terrorists or prevent them recruiting to further their cause? Warfare in the traditional sense is ill-equipped to deal with the decentralized structure of the criminal enterprise we call terrorism, which lends itself much more to criminal investigation and prosecution. Sadly, most Americans have relinquished their own common sense to the constant bombardment in the media, traditional and social. They seem too willing to give up their way of life because of the irrational incitement to panic, to which they are subject day in and day out. It doesn't help that the American people who created this government are forbidden by that same government, in the name of national security, the information necessary to make informed choices in matters of domestic and national affairs. Even though we have more guns per capita than any country in the world, the lack of training, preparation, and leadership at the local level, the lack of a militia, in other words, means we have no ability to put together a functional defense against an internal or external foe. Because the wars we have been waging are unwinnable by design, they are also easily expanded. The Senate in the Roman Republic, an elected body, had the authority to appoint a temporary dictator if they believed the danger to be great enough. They could invest him with power and authority to do whatever was necessary to deal with the problem. Unlike the Roman Senate, however, the Constitution grants no such power to either the Congress or the executive. This was not an oversight. Nowhere in that document do you even find the words emergency powers. Today, a government official simply has to announce that an emergency exists with little or no evidence, and certainly nothing that can be verified by the people. And that official suddenly and without argument assumes, like the Roman dictator, the emergency powers to deal with it. Disregard the fact that there is no support in the Constitution for those powers. The Constitution is a charter, if you will, of defined powers and, therefore, limited government. Emergency powers, on the other hand, is an unwritten license for undefined powers and, therefore, unlimited government. The two cannot coexist. If the specific constitutional limitations on the general government can be lifted simply by declaring an emergency, there are no limitations to government. The government becomes limited only by its own rhetoric, the law defined by the political hysteria created by the very officials declaring the emergency. On the contrary, the Constitution delegates no emergency powers to the general government as a whole, or to Congress, the executive, or to the Supreme Court as individual branches. It does not delegate any powers that may be exercised only in an emergency, or any powers that an emergency can call into existence. It grants no power to even declare an emergency, does not employ the word emergency, and does not define it as a legal principle. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Home Building and Loan Association versus Blaisdell, recognized that, quote, emergency does not create power. Emergency does not increase granted power or remove or diminish the restrictions upon power granted or reserved. The Constitution was adopted in a period of grave emergency. Its grants of power to the federal government and its limitations of the power of the states were determined in light of emergency, and they are not altered by emergency, close quote. Again, in another Supreme Court case called ALA Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States, the court reiterated that neither a grave national crisis nor any other extraordinary conditions can, quote, create or enlarge constitutional power. The Constitution established a national government with powers deemed to be adequate, but these powers are limited by the constitutional grants. Those who act under these grants are not at liberty to transcend the imposed limits because they believe that more or different power is necessary, close quote. Neither the states, subject to their own constitutions, nor the three branches of the general government have the authority to expand their powers or ignore their limitations simply by declaring an emergency. This is not because the Founding Fathers didn't think there might be emergencies in the future. Without using the term emergency, the Constitution recognizes several circumstances that might be considered emergencies. Congress has the authority to declare war. Congress can suspend habeas corpus when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Congress may provide for the calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Notice that Congress had those powers, not the executive. Additionally, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. In each of these cases, the Constitution specifically defines the emergency justifying the expressly delegated power, leaving no room for political interpretation. Anything beyond this is blatant usurpation of power. As you can well imagine, if these types of power can be conjured for the war on terror, they can be invoked to fight the war on crime, or the war on drugs, or even the war on poverty. What about the war on disease? With the new powers, there is no specific enemy. There is only the war. We have already seen its results. Criminals being labeled as enemy combatants, warrantless searches and seizures, civilians being imprisoned with no right to counsel, being held without bail on military bases and denied habeas corpus, people subject to rendition to foreign venues, compelled through torture and other physical and mental abuse to be witnesses against themselves, held to answer for serious crimes without a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, being denied speedy and public trials by impartial juries, being subjected to military tribunals instead, refusal on grounds of national security, both access to the evidence supposedly supporting the accusations and the ability to confront the witnesses against them, being arrested and imprisoned for opening your business contrary to a public safety order. Are you beginning to understand why the Founding Fathers relied so heavily on the militia of the several states? If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please push the subscribe button below and share this video with others who are concerned with how to constitutionally take our country back. If you would like to receive notices of when upcoming videos are released, please press the bell, and you will be among the first to get my new videos. Thank you for watching.